second event of the year, focus on the role of the petrophysicists and geoscientists in energy transition and carbon capture, utilization, and storage, a topic that is becoming highly relevant for energy companies worldwide. Today, Andres Mantilla, Mike Simmons, Robert Laronga, and Christy Kirkman will have 10 minutes to share their knowledge and experience, and 5 more minutes for question and answer. Remember that if you are interested in joining us or participating as a presenter in our events, you can contact us by email or social media. Now, I would like to introduce Andres Mantilla. Andres graduated from the University of Santander, Industrial University of Santander. He has had more than 20 years of experience in the oil and gas industry and has held different positions in companies such as Ecopetrol, BP, Maersk Oil, Marathon Oil, as head of exploration, senior reservoir engineer, lead reservoir engineer, advanced senior reservoir engineer, geophysicist, technical manager of pre-salt evaluation projects in Brazil, and director of the Technology and Innovation Center with ICP Ecopetrol. Welcome, Andres. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria Florencia, and thanks for all that connected to this event, and thank you for the invitation to SPWLA. I'm going to offer you a few views about energy transition and visions from Colombia. I would like to start with this picture here. I had the opportunity to be in a place like this a few years ago, probably 2017, in San Rafael in Chile, in front of a glacier. I can tell you that the water was not so still. It was full of blocks of ice that were dislodging from the glacier. And this is the okay. And really, what I want to say is that this is not okay. This is a picture 107 years after the previous one, where you can appreciate that the glacier has pretty much disappeared from the coast. There was a farewell ceremony actually in 2014 in Iceland to raise awareness about what's going on with ice sheets as part of this major climate crisis that we're facing. So a lot of the time, our industry, the oil and gas industry, is blamed for being the culprit of this climate crisis. But what is really behind the depletion of natural capital and global warming? It's really excessive energy consumption. And what is the cause of that? It's really overconsumption, it's overproduction, it's overtrading, it's wasteful data exchanges, and it's really, a major thing that is caused by culture or practices of consumption. And I wanted to start this talk by raising awareness of that. We need to be more conscious of in what way are we using the natural resources, because the rest of the talk we are going to talk about technology and maybe political and regulation changes that are required to face this climate crisis. But culture, our consumption habits is what's driving all these things. So things start emerging that are very impactful for the oil and gas industry. And for instance, in 2021, I'm pretty sure many of you noticed the International Energy Agency report, in which one of the scenarios postulated some decisions that need to be made, some actions that need to be taken, including this one: no new oil and gas fields approved for development, no new coal mines or mine extensions. And that's one example. This is another one, the carbon take back obligation, which has been investigated by some countries, particularly in Europe, but also companies in the United States like Chevron, in which pretty much anyone that's selling fossil fuels must certify that a fraction of all the CO2 generated, that's scopes 1, 2, and 3, gets geologically sequestered. And that's where CCUS starts becoming important. So this is the current situation, and under that carbon take back obligation, the oil and gas producer will have to pay somebody, could be a subsidiary of the company, but it could be a third party, to store the CO2 geologically, to sequester it in the subsurface. And by doing that, some certificates, some carbon storage certificates would be generated, and those would be traded. And under that scheme, it would be possible to pretty much scale up CCUS. Starting from a sequestration fraction that is very, very small, and it will raise to 10% by 2030, will become 100% by 2050. So that will make fossil fuels less competitive. So all companies pretty much have started making pledges, and Ecopetrol is not an exception. We have committed to reduce 25% of our scopes 1 and 2 emissions by 2030, and 50% of the total scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions by 2050. And this is just an example, but pretty much all companies are getting on board with their decarbonization targets and their net zero commitments. So what are we doing in Ecopetrol in different fronts? We are establishing, for instance, a hydrogen route as part of the decarbonization efforts and pledges of the company, but also we're about to announce commitments when it comes to CCUS. And from the R&D Center of Ecopetrol, the Technology and Innovation Center, the Colombian Petroleum Institute, we have been advancing an agenda to meet those targets that the company and those pledges that the company is making. And it's in different fronts, as you can see here. It's nature-based solutions on one part, but also CO2 capture from industrial processes. There you can start seeing a connection with formation evaluation that is required when it comes to CO2 enhanced oil recovery and CO2 storage monitoring. But also fronts, like I said, in terms of low emissions hydrogen. And when you talk about blue hydrogen, then you need to store the CO2. And also in some other forms of renewables, particularly geothermal, that will require formation evaluation as well. Those are not the only lines. We're also working on advanced petroleum materials for non-combustible applications, such as advanced fibers and composite materials. So that's just to give you a glimpse of what we're doing from the R&D Center. This one here is to start making the point for CCUS. And really reaching net zero will be impossible without CCUS. That's why it's so important. What you see here are two lines. One of them is all the measures that could be taken to reduce CO2 production. And the blue one is the measures that could be taken to increase CO2 storage. And what you can see is in the vertical axis, the cost of carbon abatement in dollars per ton of CO2. So what's very evident is that for about 2/3 to 3/4 of the curve, you can abate it with prices that are pretty much existing technology or emerging technology. But for the final 25% or the final third of the curve, you pretty much don't have an option unless you do carbon storage. And because of that, CCUS is seeing a renaissance, and a number of projects are being progressed worldwide. And you can see the timeline here and the number of projects that are emerging, and a number of hubs. The concept of hubs for carbon capture storage or carbon capture utilization and storage worldwide is really increasing. More very recently in the US, it has been announced that and also in Norway, some new leases have been granted by the governments for CCS projects to different companies. In Norway, the news is about Equinor getting the leases. But in the US, there are two projects in Louisiana and in Texas. The latter one granted to Talos, which is pretty much the equivalent to a startup in the oil and gas industry. They're getting big in the business of carbon capture and storage. So how does all these relate to formation evaluation? Pretty much the most important piece that you need to guarantee when you're doing CCS or CCUS is ensuring that the seal is going to hold the CO2 that gets injected into a reservoir. So seal characterization is very important, and techniques such as elastic impedance are going to be very important to characterize those seals. And of course, petrophysics and formation evaluation, rock physics, is going to be very important to understand what kind of attributes can you get from seismic to understand the seal, its extension, and how the lateral variability of the reservoirs with respect to the seal are. So that's one part of the technologies that is required, but another one very important is geomechanics evaluation. And that's because major fractures or faults can be prone to leaking CO2 if they cut through the seal. So that integration of stratigraphy, seal, and geomechanics, structural geology is very, very important for assessing the containment and the risk of leakage. And when it comes to monitoring, then the time-lapse seismic changes might be detectable. For instance, in this case, what you see in this graph, the percentage change of acoustic impedance versus bulk modulus for a process of CO2 displacing water, you would see a major reduction, importantly detectable reduction in impedance that will be recorded if you do 4D seismic. So bulk modulus, as you know, it's a function of porosity. So if you have good porosities, like in this case of Sleipner, where you see the different time-lapse surveys that were acquired over the years, this is CO2 coming from natural gas processing that is being injected into the Utsira formation. And you see very much how the reservoir gets illuminated, and some of the stratigraphic changes are highlighted in that case. But another application is CO2 enhanced oil recovery. That would be very important in different geographies, and there are some opportunities for these in Colombia as well. And in this case study that I'm quoting here, where they in the Weyburn Midale unit in North America, they were injecting CO2 for years and conducted a CO2 EOR project. They pretty much collected a number of good practices that can be incorporated into your projects. And to do that, you need to understand what the displacement processes are and a good integration with reservoir engineering is very important for this purpose. For instance, in this case, this is the case of immiscible CO2 injection into a depleted reservoir. But there may be some other cases where the injection is miscible. So you need to understand all the thermodynamics of that, because depending on that, you will get a different signal of acoustic impedance change versus both modules. Depending on whether you have probably a previous process before CO2 injection, which in most cases would be water displacing oil, versus CO2 displacing oil at irreducible water saturation, which, depending on how the displacement is happening in the saturation state, you may get different kind of responses. And what they have showed in that case of the Weyburn unit is that through injection in different horizontal wells, they get different signals in the seismic. So from amplitude changes to travel time changes, but all that can be understood from formation evaluation and petrophysics. So, and the other aspect that you need to take into account is the risk of induced seismicity. And so an integration of geomechanics with engineering and petrophysics would allow you to contain the risk, mitigate the risk of induced seismicity. Like in this case, there are some periods of time where you have the blue columns, the blue bars, vertical bars here, appearing in some periods of time where they have been preceded by high CO2 injection. So with that, I will conclude my talk, and thank you again to Spwla for inviting me.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Andres Mantilla. And to be aligned with the schedule, we will start the next speaker. If someone have any question, please write in the chat box. So now, Mike Simon will introduce digital geoscience technology and screening for carbon storage. To may know a little about our distinguished speaker, he serves as a technology fellow for geoscience and the energy transition at Landmark Halliburton. Mike's career has spanned both industry and academia, working at BP, Aberdeen, and Cambridge universities. Mike's current research focus is characterization of the subsurface in order to identify both advantaged hydrocarbons and suitable storage sites in the low carbon energy transition. Welcome, Mike.
Good evening, good afternoon. Many thanks for the opportunity to present at this forum on the energy transition as it relates to Colombia and to formation evaluation and subsurface understanding. Today, I'd like to present on some work we're doing at Halliburton on characterizing the subsurface using digital geoscience technology in order to screen for key areas for carbon storage. And this is work carried out by myself and my colleague, Andy Davis. So this is an image that shows a carbon dioxide plume in the subsurface at the Sleipner field. And there are a number of key takeaways to get from this image. The first is that when we look at how CO2 behaves in the subsurface, we have to think about the process over decades, if not centuries. And we have to model the behavior of CO2 as a supercritical fluid using rather unique flow physics, which are more akin to hydrocarbon migration than simple hydrocarbon extraction. And as we've heard in this meeting already, we have to think about seal integrity. But what I want to focus on in this talk is the other red box on this slide, which is heterogeneity. effectively understanding the volume of rock into which we're injecting CO2. And that will have a profound impact on the way the CO2 plume behaves and the amount of CO2 that we can store and its injectivity over a period of years. So heterogeneity is extremely important to understand, both for understanding the container and its seal. And on the right here, you can see two laboratory experiments in a published paper, which show the simulated behavior of a CO2 plume in different types of storage unit. At the top, we have a homogeneous unit in which the lithologies are pretty continuous throughout. And in the bottom, we have a heterogeneous reservoir in which there is distinct layering of high permeability and porosity units along with lower porosity and permeability units. And you can see that in the pink colors, the CO2 plume as modeled behaves rather differently. In the homogeneous reservoir, the CO2 plume migrates towards the top of the reservoir and layers out against the top seal. Whereas in the heterogeneous reservoir, we have a very different behavior of the CO2 plume. It's using capillary trapping to be trapped against heterogeneous baffles and barriers within the reservoir. And this means that the plume migrates in a different way away from the injection site and requires us to think about not only a different capacity estimation for the reservoir, but a different injectivity strategy into how we might inject CO2 into such a storage unit. Now, this heterogeneity can be at a very small scale, often 1 to 10 meter scale, perhaps even less. And that means that wireline logs are critical for characterizing heterogeneity. So there are a number of standard measurements for quantifying heterogeneity, but they don't always capture the degree of heterogeneity that a geologist would contemplate within a rock unit. So you can see on the right 5 synthetic well logs here using permeability, but it could be any proxy that would be used to measure lithology. And you can see that to a geologist, those rock successions are rather different. Some have rather massive units, others have more finely interbedded units. But because typical measurements of heterogeneity focus on the overall variance in the degree of heterogeneity within a rock unit, all those rather different rock units actually have the same values of mean, standard deviation, coefficient of variation, Lorentz coefficient, Dijkstra-Parsons coefficient. So we need to take into account a different measure of heterogeneity, which investigates the frequency of variation. So we've brought in a new calculation, which takes really the frequency of variation within a rock unit. So on the image on the right, you can see 2 different well logs, one in red, one in purple, and the solid line is the original data. And what we look at is the successive difference in downhole measurements in those logs. And then that gives us a new log, which we call the delta data, the measurement of the successive difference. And then we calculate the variance on that delta data. And that delta variance is a very good measure of the frequency of heterogeneity. So you can see in those 2 examples, which are rather different geologically, the red example has a delta variance of 17, and the purple log has a delta variance of 44. So quite different and distinct, and that helps us to characterize this key feature, which is important for carbon storage. Now we can plot that out spatially and look at the differences. So each of those colored dots represents variations in some of this heterogeneity that's calculated. The red dots are more homogeneous, the blue dots show a greater variance. And that relates to the underlying geology. So we can measure out these variations and we can explain them by thinking about the geology that underpins that and make some predictions from that, which will come back to at the end of this talk on why that's important for, if you like, calculating an overall score for the relative advantage, let's say, of a storage unit over another. Now, there are other ways we can approach heterogeneity. We can look at the way in which the rocks are deposited. And today we use Earth system science, that is understanding how the rocks are transported to their point of deposition, how sediment flux, how paleoclimate influences upon that. And you can see a paleoclimate simulation spinning around there for the late Cretaceous. And that information can be used in numerical simulations to model the subsurface and its heterogeneity. So we use forward stratigraphic modeling. And forward stratigraphic modeling takes features like sediment flux, paleoclimate, subsidence, sea level change, and uses those to generate a numerical simulation, which you can see in the animation on the left, to model in a particular area how a body of rock is being deposited and the variation within it. Now, of course, you want to probably make more than one simulation because some of the factors have variability, which you want to capture, but you can combine all that information to give you a probability of facies and hence a probability of heterogeneity. And that's really important because the key phrase here is creating geological plausibility of our potential storage units. And we want models that are plausible and realistic and capture that range of variation. Go on now quickly to capacity. So we can screen regions for potential rock units that are prospective for storage. There are a number of simple factors which control which rock units have the best potential, largely based on their depth and how that relates to temperature and pressure, and of course their overall facies. But what we want to get to is a yet to store calculation, and that is the theoretical capacity of a rock unit, either at the scale of a fairway or at the scale of a storage site. We're going to have a look at the scale of a fairway. So the calculation, you can see it at the bottom, is very similar to a Stoke calculation. You need to know the volume of rock, the net to gross, the porosity, the density of the CO2 at the depth you're injecting, and a storage efficiency factor, which is a factor which notes that not all the pore space will be filled with CO2. So we've got to get to those values. And very often we're dealing with quite sparse data. Now, we may be dealing with depleted reservoirs in which there is quite a bit of information from a field, but very often we may be wanting to inject into a saline aquifer where there is relatively limited information and very little direct measurements, say, of porosity. So there we want to use calculations to get to those values. Now, there are lots of standard petrophysical techniques and also a growing armory of machine learning techniques. And we've been exploring machine learning and coming up with some very good results on using a large training data set to train an ML algorithm and make porosity predictions. And you can see some of the results here. So the dashed lines here are the predictions, or the red line on the image on the left, and the dots are the actual observed measurements in this blind data trial. And you can see that the correspondence is pretty high, and we're quite pleased with those results. So we can take logs where we don't have direct measurements of porosity, and we can use the machine learning algorithm to quickly calculate values. The point is that we've got sparse data and we need quickly to get some values, and we can use this technique, which then allows us to fill in the values for the equation and make capacity calculations. So here is a potential storage unit in the Middle East, the Bergan Formation. The green colors highlight where that rock unit is most prospective to be a storage unit. And then in that high graded area, we've taken log information and used that to calculate some of the values that we need to get to our capacity calculation. A further example here is from the Sleipner Fairway, the Utsira Formation in the Norwegian sector of the North Sea. And again, we've taken the values that we need for the capacity calculation for the overall storage fairway and come up with a calculation, both P10, P50 and P90 for the amount of carbon that you can store. And our P50 value is quite similar to the NPD's own calculation. The point here, of course, is that what you're trying to do is rank different fairways in terms of their potential capacity. So you can high grade certain fairways and focus on looking at sites for storage within them, and then do further detailed calculations on those specific sites. So overall, we need to understand the character of the subsurface. We need to get into heterogeneity. We need to look at thickness. We need to know porosities, permeabilities, and we can plot those out and develop an overall value for the relative advantage for storage of individual rock units and see how that varies across a fairway. So we come back to the Rotliegende unit in the southern North Sea here, and you can see different colors on the dots, which correspond to different values for the advantage of storage. And you can see that areas towards the south are more advantageous than those to the north. And that can be partly explained geologically and gives us a feel for the potential high grading of storage within that potential fairway. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to taking any questions you have. Thank you very much.
Hi, Mike. Thank you so much. We have only 2 minutes for question. We have a question in the chat, and that is, how can we monitor CO2 injection using electrical logs, and what or which logs serves us for this monitoring?
That's not a question I could answer. Monitoring. Most monitoring is done through seismic, as the previous speaker showed. If we use 4D time-lapse seismic, we can use the understanding of the overall variations in impedance to see how a plume is behaving at the subsurface. So standard monitoring is done for hot seismic data rather than flow. Is there a further question?
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Well, I think we are starting with the followed speaker. And thank you so much, Mike, for your participation. I appreciate it so much. Ulysses, please.
Yes, thank you, Mike. Thank you. Now, our next presentation is going to be in charge of Robert Laronga. Robert is graduated from Cornell University in 1994 with a BA in geology, and he joins Schlumberger as a wireline field engineer in the Permian Basin. Among varied assignments in the US and internationally, Robert's careers include 7 years of field work, both land and offshore, 5 years in the capacity of headquarters geologist, 6 years as integrated team lead for unconventionals, and more recently, 2 years as petrophysics domain for onshore North America amid growing CCS and CCUS. So he has also consulted on over a dozen CCS and CCUS projects since 2019, helping operators from various industries to conduct data acquisition and analysis programs to reduce project risk, assure safe and economic operations, and satisfy regulatory requirements. So please welcome Robert. Robert, is all yours. Thank you.
Okay, are you going to give me control, Ulysses?
Yes, yes, you are in control already.
Oh, I am already. Okay, I don't see the same pointer we had. Well, thanks for the intro, and thanks everyone. Thanks to the committee for the invitation. Thanks for coming to listen. Okay, I see. I've got the pointer now. Yep. Cool. I've got the laser pointer. All right. So it's actually the talks fall in a very good order here, because I think Andres did a very good job of laying out what some of the major risks are with these projects. And then Mike did a very nice job talking about some of the uncertainties when you're looking on a large scale prospecting and trying to decide where to go drill. And where I come in as a petrophysicist and a geologist, working for Schlumberger, my view is everything that happens once we drill a well and get some data from that well, and from there on out operating the project. So logs, core fluid samples, the analysis of those samples, all of that stuff. We got to make it fit in 10 minutes. So I'm going to try to hit a few highlights. I'm going to try to underscore some things that are different from the way we do things in the E&P industry. You guys that have been around the industry and have worked some of these areas like EOR, underground gas storage, or unconventionals, you will recognize some things in common as you start to venture into CCUS, but it's all a little bit different. Some of the workflows are absolutely turned backwards. For example, rather than trying to figure out how to break rocks, now we're trying to figure out how to make sure we don't break rocks. So that's just an example. Another thing that makes this very different, you've probably heard we run some of the biggest logging suites in history on some of these projects, and there's good reason for that. The subsurface part of these projects, even with all the logging, is typically anywhere from 40% all the way down to 10% of the cost of the project. So the de-risking that we're doing with the data is extremely important. And one of the reasons we collect a lot of data is because there's so many zones besides the reservoir that we have to worry about. So you see in the figure over here, typically we've got an injection zone. We've got a confining zone we need to do some evaluation on. Typically, we're considering more than one injection zone, and then that's going to have its own confining zone. The regulators also like to see that you have a backup confining zone if the first confining zone is breached, and they'll look favorably on that in your permit application. But this means that you have to do the evaluation on all of these zones. In addition to this, there's big concern about protecting potential sources of underground drinking water. And so there's some evaluation to be done up here too. So we're really evaluating multiple targets. And the goal for all of this, for us as petrophysicists at the end, is to populate realistic dynamic models that go beyond what we're used to in E&P. So we're talking fully coupled dynamic models that honor not just the hydraulic processes, but also the mechanical processes, the chemical processes that take place with this, and fourth, the thermal processes. So all these things need to be considered and how they interact with each other. I'm privileged to be in a company where we've been in this business for a long time. So the stuff didn't just develop overnight. As a company, we've done over 100 projects, and you see it really went up here after the first EU directive came out. And in fact, we had a CEO who had the vision at that time to found a business line, which still exists in Schlumberger today under the Schlumberger New Energy division. And we had a bit of a lull during the teens in terms of the number of worldwide projects, but it's really picking up now. And in the United States, US and Canada alone this year will probably touch various parts of 20 plus projects. So it's even gone beyond what you see here. In that time, we've developed a stage gate process. And as I said, I'll be talking about what happens from appraisal and on into operation with a bit of the monitoring. Not really going to talk about pre-selection. This is very similar to the E&P project lifecycle. The part at the end here and the liability at the end, of course, is a lot bigger. And that's one of the key differences is the amount of time you have to take care of this before you quit operating it. So when we talk about the risks involved in these things and the measurements that we acquire to do due diligence, I like to break it into into 5 pieces, right? So the first piece is storage. Is my storage there? And is the site I've chosen really going to be enough to handle the volume that I need to store? And not just the overall volume, but the time versus volume aspect of that. You notice at the very end of this, there's a dynamic model. That's a key part to figuring out how big is really the storage. So then we come to the topic of containment. And we could really split this into 2 aspects. The reservoir aspect. Now this is geology, structural geology, tectonics, a bit of petrophysics, and a lot of geomechanics. And then the other aspect of containment deals with the wellbore itself. This is especially big on EOR projects or depleted field storage projects where you have a lot of existing wellbores that you have to assess. But in any case, keeping track of the condition of your wellbore in a corrosive environment is a huge part of the safety of these projects. Establishing injectivity. So injectivity is the bridge between the amount you need to store and keeping your pressure near wellbore low enough that you don't trigger unwanted events. So getting that. And so here there's typically a step rate test and a pressure fall off. And there's a lot of petrophysicists can get involved in terms of how we instrument that test downhole, because there's a lot of good info that comes out. Finally, there's the monitoring part, which is ongoing and feeding data back to tune the model to see where the CO2 is going in the subsurface, not just the CO2, but the pressure as well. And so that's kind of the whole picture. Now, each one of these is a half-hour talk. I'm just going to hit a few highlights now very quickly, right? So as petrophysicists, we all know how to evaluate porosity. It's well established, and it's not much different in these wells. But I'm going to say that porosity is just the beginning. Once you've picked a site, this simple relationship of storage capacity to the reservoir size and the porosity and the effective CO2 storage isn't good enough anymore. It would be fine if we had millions of years to inject our CO2 and wait for everything to equilibrate across the entire reservoir. It would hold true. Most reservoirs actually can hold a lot less than what you'll come up with this relationship. The other thing you see, we have this wonderful three-way interaction between the rock, the brine, and the injected CO2 stream. And that has some very interesting effects over time, both positive and negative, that we need to evaluate. Compared to E&P, as a petrophysicist, you will spend way more time looking at seal quality. Why? Well, once I decide where to go and drill a well, and I prove there's a hydrocarbon column, I've proven my seal, right? I probably don't care. Maybe if I have a dry hole, I will take a look at the rock above the intended reservoir to see if that was what the problem was and where things went wrong. Here, it's absolutely imperative because we are drilling into something that probably has a normal pressure gradient like this through the reservoir unit and up to the base of the seal. But we're going to make it see pressure and stress that it's never seen before. Because as we start injecting CO2 and growing this column, we create a capillary pressure difference. And that guy may get big enough, depending how big the column gets, that we exceed the capillary threshold entry pressure, and we actually push right into the cap rock without breaking it. So looking at permeability of these cap rocks is very important. Looking at that capillary threshold entry pressure, very, very important. Talk about another point, the wireline formation tester. You will run more of these than you've probably ever done in your career, unless you work deep water exploration. It's really the star of the show. So the first part of it is water sampling. Water samples are necessary and often required by regulation in multiple zones for geochemical baselines for comparison to later samples when you're monitoring after injection starts. You also need to get some stock of the water in the injection zone so you can see how it interacts with the matrix and the CO2. And when you're doing this, it can be quite challenging, especially if the well's drilled with water-based mud. You really need to think about how you're going to assure a clean sample. And luckily, we have some very unique things that we can monitor downhole as we pump fluid out of the formation that help to assure that we can get a clean water sample. The other side of it is what we call mini frac or stress testing. We do this sometimes in unconventionals, but I would say the most popular way to do this is the old defit, using the drill string right after drilling out of casing. Well, in these wells, you're probably going to have to do it in a large number of zones. And unless you want to run a casing string right above each zone you want to test, it's just impractical. So the formation tester is how we do it. We isolate the interval with packers. We pump in up to 6,000 PSI differential pressure. We measure exactly what the frac pressure is. And that's a really key calibration point for the geomechanical model. The final piece I want to talk about, and it's all I really have time for, is time-lapse logging with pulse neutron tools in casing. We do more of this than in any other type of project. We do this in gas storage. We do this sometimes in CO2 floods, EOR projects, to see how efficient are we being with the CO2 sweep. Here, you'll record a baseline log, and then once you start injecting at the beginning, you'll do one of these every couple months because you want to be absolutely sure nothing catastrophic is going wrong. And eventually, when you see the CO2 is going where you want, you may slow down to every 6 months or so. And then post-closure, you see what happens. So of course, the red shading represents the CO2, and you can see the start of injection here, the end of injection here, and there was just a little bit that migrated up into higher formations, but this was well within the operating parameters of the project. I'll say that modern pulse neutron tools that have come out in the last few years make a huge difference in this application. First, because our tools these days are so well compensated for changing borehole tubulars, changing fluids in the borehole, in the annulus, things like that, that the porosity is always dead on comparable between runs, and the sigma as well, even when things change. So that's very helpful for time lapse. You know, the other thing we've done recently is to introduce a direct gas measurement with our pulse neutron. And that's neat because that is sensitive to both the annulus and the formation. So by comparing different measurements, we can figure out if CO2 is actually going up through the formation or if it's in the annulus. That's all I really have time for. And I'll just say thanks again for listening and for inviting me here.
Thanks a lot, Robert. A very interesting presentation. We really appreciate it. I think in terms of keeping the timing, please, to the audience, if you can write down your questions to Rob, and so we can share with Rob later on, and Rob is going to be replying to all of you. Thank you so much, Rob. And now our next presenter is Christy. Christy Kiersman is a project engineer lead in Schlumberger Reservoir Laboratories in Houston, Texas, since 2013. She joined Schlumberger Houston Laboratory, working as analyst engineer with focus in routine core analysis, geomechanics portfolio, and tight rock analysis. Since 2018, Christy has successfully managed over 350 projects from over 100 customers around the globe to date. In 2022, she was promoted to project engineer lead, overseeing all data qualities, engineers and project manager, also building a strong client base in CCUS. Before his lab-related duties, Christy spent her time as bioassay laboratory manager in MI Suaco, a Schlumberger company. Before this assignment, Christy was postgraduate research associate in the Center for Life Science and Technology in the University of Houston College of Engineering. So welcome, Christy. You have the control already and all is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ulysses, and welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Today, we will take a high-level look at the role of core and cuttings in the de-risking of CO2 injection wells. Okay, the timeline here shows the entire CO2 injection lifecycle from site pre-selection through monitoring all the way through to 100 years in the future and site closure. Core and cuttings play a critical role in the initial site selection, and appraisal processes, but digital SCAL offers a mean for performing actual risk analysis from development through the closure step. Schlumberger differentiates from all our competitors as we can offer a fully integrated digital solution throughout the entire life cycle of the project. Okay, today I will focus on 3 areas where the laboratory can provide value and reduce the risks associated with CO2 injection. These are the use of cuttings to pre-screen for good quality seals, the use of geomechanical testing for evaluation of seal integrity, and the use of SCAL and digital SCAL for the understanding of fluid-fluid, rock-fluid, and rock-fluid-fluid interactions, where one fluid is your in situ fluid and the other is CO2. Okay, this slide contains a lot of text, so I ask you not to worry about trying to read everything over here on the left. So I'll cover it in the next few slides, but approximately 500 days before CO2 injection starts, pre-screening and appraisal should be performed. For this, we need to investigate 4 trapping mechanisms. Sorry, the pointer is not behaving. Okay. First is structural trapping. This is where CO2 migrates due to the pressure and density gradients, and where CO2 can be trapped by caprock or structural features. The second is residual trapping. This is where the gas phase is immobilized due to the effects of relative permeability and capillary pressure. The third, solubility trapping, where there's dissolution of CO2 into the aqueous phase. And the fourth is mineral trapping, where there is mineral generation due to the interaction with the reservoir rock. Risk assessment, in addition to regulatory requirements, dictate the static and dynamic rock and fluid properties to be measured. The static measurements include FIT, fluid inclusion technologies, and geomechanics, and the dynamic includes SCAL and digital SCAL. The first phase of the laboratory analysis will be the screening of cuttings. This is through fluid inclusion analysis, or what we call FIT. Okay, fluid inclusion technology is a patented Schlumberger product that provides a means to screen an entire wellbore for the presence of a seal based on mass spectrometry and microthermometry of inclusions. Inclusions are tiny pockets of fluid trapped between the rock grains and any cementation. These inclusions are perfectly preserved in the rock over time. For this reason, cuttings can be taken at any time in history from the well, and they can be used for pre-screening. Top seal failure is distinguished in the data by FIS responses that continue through the seal into the overlying section. In the center, the track on the left, the track on the left shows C1 and C7. Where you have C1 and C7, there is evidence of migration through the seal. In the absence of C1 and C7, you can see that there is no migration. That is evidence of a good seal. Further evaluation of the caprock integrity is recommended through geomechanical studies on core material. Another product of FIT is microthermometry, which will provide additional information such as API gravity from petroleum inclusions and salinity from aqueous inclusions. So let's look into why API gravity and salinity are important in pre-screening for an injection site. API gravity from petroleum inclusions are used in 2 ways. Sorry. First, when API gravity is greater than 25, it is good for miscible CO2 flooding. And where API gravity is less than 22, it is more transitional and can be immiscible. This is an indicator to determine potential for miscible or immiscible flooding based on the inclusions. Second, we can evaluate the seal integrity by measuring the API gravity of the fluid in the inclusions above and below a potential seal. Is there any evidence of migration through that seal? Second, microthermometry on aqueous inclusions can be used in 2 ways. First, can we even inject? Low salinity reservoirs are reserved for drinking water. In the US, any aquifer with salinity less than 10,000 parts per million is a potential drinking water source. Therefore, CO2 cannot be injected. Second, seal integrity can be evaluated by differences in salinity and fluid in inclusions above and below the potential seal. Seals need to be further evaluated through geomechanical studies on physical core samples. Okay, now let's look into the rock fluid interactions from a geomechanics perspective. First, it is critical to establish a safe injection pressure. Too high and you risk damaging the cap rock. Too low and the process is not economically favorable. Second, how does CO2 affect the deviatoric stress of the rock? CO2 will render a cap rock more ductile, as seen in the stress strain profile. Laboratory tests can mimic field conditions before and after injection to provide the operator with enough information to optimize the injection pressure, which is usually about 80 to 90% of the frac gradient. Oh. Okay. Okay, the workflow shown here is a laboratory experiment I mentioned in the last slide. The stress-strain relationship is measured on the cap rock without the presence of CO2. Then the sample is flooded with supercritical CO2 to measure relative permeability as a function of dissolution, precipitation, and saturation change. After the core flood, the same sample is evaluated again for the stress-strain response to optimize the injection pressure to reduce the risk of cap rock damage. Also measured is the thermal expansion or contraction of the rock. The same supercritical CO2 core flood workflow can be used in conjunction with petrology, mineralogy, and elemental analysis to determine how the reservoir rock changes in the presence of CO2. Okay, now how can we predict the future? Laboratory tests are a fixed duration, so it can be a challenge to predict how the reservoirs and seals will behave over the course of 100+ years or before the site is closed. Digital Scal offers a solution. Digital Scal starts with a small core sample that is imaged at several resolutions from the macro to the micro to the nano scale. A rock model and a fluid model are built to simulate the formation before, during, and after CO2 injection. Input parameters are taken from known field properties and physical Scal inputs to output a dynamic simulation that can be adjusted based on changing field conditions. Okay, Digital Scal takes the physical experiments and it extrapolates the effects over a geologic timescale, accounting for long-term effects. Models are created using the DHD hydrodynamic simulator, a proprietary Schlumberger tool, where various parameters can be adjusted to explore new physical scenarios without the need for a physical core sample. This product is a culmination of over 20 years of development, testing, and implementation, and has been applied globally for reservoir development since 2011. Properties that can be measured are relative permeability, capillary pressure, solubility in brine, chemical reactions, rock dissolution, solids precipitation, adsorption, and thermal effects. Okay, so in conclusion, laboratory measurements are critical to understanding the subsurface and understanding the cap rock integrity and injection rate. Subsurface evaluation includes reservoir characterization, pore volume assessment, aquifer salinity understanding, matrix chemistry, and fluid chemistry. Injectivity includes fluid-fluid interaction, rock-fluid interaction, geomechanics, and critical stress of natural fractures. Okay, and thank you so much for your time. In this slide, I've included all of the subject matter experts, well, some of the subject matter experts in the areas that I mentioned: fluid inclusion technology, geomechanics, Scal, digital Scal, and petrophysics. Thank you very much for your time.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Christy. You know, we have some, we recovered some time during the presentations. We speed up a little bit at the beginning, so I think we have some additional time for questions. First of all, I have some questions for Christy, if you don't mind. So one of the questions for you, Christy, is has the digital Scal has been applied to a reservoir in Latin America?
Actually, yes, it has. In 2014, in the Kasabi field, there was a chemical EOR polymer flood that was performed that had a digital scalp component. And this was presented at an SPE conference, and I can provide that citation to anyone who is interested.
All right, very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure, thank you. And I was curious about the trapped inclusions. How are they released for mass spectrometry?
Okay, so that's actually done. There's a tray, and then there's a piston that comes down. So you have a cutting that is perfectly preserved, and the piston comes down, and it basically breaks apart, pulverizes that cutting, and what's eluted up into the mass spec we're able to measure all the components from methane all the way through heptane and multiple other components. So that's part of the standard deliverable. Rob may be able to expand a little bit on this.
Okay, thank you, Christian. Yeah. Very, very interesting. I have I kept in mind like 1 or 2 questions for Rob. Rob, if you don't mind, if you can open your microphone. Regarding your presentation, I wonder on what kind of reservoir rock do you think it make the most effective CO2 storage? Which type of rock, for instance?
I think the jury is out on that. Different people have different ideas, but personally, I like sandstones. Just because at least compared to the carbonates we have in North America, sandstones just tend to have a lot more porosity to start with. But one thing I would say that's interesting, when you look at porosity versus the actual storage efficiency. So one of the factors in there is the efficiency of storing CO2, right? And excluding the drying effect that I talked about in the chat. When you do relative perm and saturation experiments with oil and water, you typically see that the water will drain out of the core until you get up to about 65% oil saturation. In CO2 storage, it is very rare to see rocks that will take more than 50% CO2 before you just can't push any more in, right? That's in the short time. But, good sandstones probably can have like a 40 or 45% storage efficiency. So meaning you can, in a short time, you can get it into 45% of the pore space. And whereas, I think carbonates can be either higher or lower, depending.
Okay.
Less predictable, I'd say.
Okay, thank you. To the committee, do you have any additional question for Mike or for Andres?
Yes, we have one said, if carbon storage focuses on depleted fields, is not the character of the surface well known? That is for Mike.
Could you just repeat the question, please? Sorry, I didn't quite catch it.
If carbon storage focuses on depleted fields, is not the character of the subsurface well known?
Yeah, okay, that's a good question. Obviously, there is a lot of focus in the industry on going to depleted fields as a carbon storage location, and they are data rich relatively. Although remember, even in a depleted field, we only sample a small proportion of the volume of the rock, although we can make better predictions. But there are some issues with depleted fields. Leakage around the existing well infrastructure is always a worry. And that's why also for the capacity question as well, saline aquifers are regarded by the IEA as probably the likely major source of carbon storage as we go into the future. There are less complications with existing infrastructure, but the downside of saline aquifers is their relatively limited data. But we should expect saline aquifers to be a major location for carbon storage. So yeah, that's what I'd say.
Yeah. Hey, Mike. Totally agree with you on the the risk of legacy wells around the depleted field providing leakage path to surface. But one other thing I'd throw in on the aquifer storage, which is kind of the downside to that, or the real pro with the depleted fields. When you're doing an EOR project in a depleted field, the reservoir pressure is managed carefully at all times because you're making withdrawals and you're never going to go above that original pressure when the field was new. The big risk with the aquifer storage, of course, is we're taking the rocks to pressures that they've never seen before. And in some cases with water disposal, we see that a couple hundred PSI is all it takes to start having some really undesirable consequences. So it's an interesting balance between the two, where your risks are and where your benefits are.
But it's also, I think, a question of, it's in different basins, it'll be different between saline aquifers and depleted fields. I'm thinking in the Middle East, for example, an area I know relatively well, there are some good EOR projects coming on stream, which are going to be a major contributor to carbon storage. But in terms of, if you like, being in the ideal temperature pressure window for carbon storage, you're often looking at the higher stratigraphy in that region, at rock units which have never ever really been considered as major reservoirs, yet are porous, in this case, carbonates. The Uma Formation, which is towards the top of the stratigraphy, and that has an economic plus as well in being less expensive to inject into, just on simple drilling costs. So I think in different basins, depending on where the depleted fields lie in the stratigraphic column versus where the saline aquifers lie, then it'll be different for each basin.
Excellent. Thank you. Great intervention, great talk, really very, very fruitful. Do we have any questions for Andres Mantilla? We do have questions.
We have another question here for Andres Mantilla, said about what is his perspective about the energetic transition in Colombia.
Well, thank you for the question. I think that's an ongoing process. It's a non-stop process. We need to move forward in that direction. There is just no way around it. And it's not only in Colombia, it's really worldwide. This is a collective effort that we need to pursue because the climate crisis is going to affect us all and the future generations. So I think it's going to move forward. We see some important figures in terms of adding renewables to the matrix, to the electricity matrix here in Colombia. And progressively, I hope that we will have CCUS. I think it's going to be immiscible EOR to begin with around the Middle Mag fields close to the Barranquilla refinery first. And we will see also efforts to progressively scale up hydrogen, low emissions hydrogen, starting with probably processes linked to the Barranquilla refinery through gasification of some petroleum molecules tied to like I said, CO2 EOR. That process produces, low emissions hydrogen, blue hydrogen, and that will be important. And eventually green hydrogen when it becomes competitive price-wise against the fossil fuels based gray hydrogen. I think that's my my summary of what you would see in the near future. Probably some geothermal. There is an important potential for geothermal energy around the central Cordillera, and you know, we may see some of that.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much. Before going to Micah, let me tell you that due to some issues at the beginning of this event with the image and the microphones, we're gonna upload some better quality videos to YouTube, so it's available for everyone. I really appreciate, we really appreciate your support and your patience. So, but we are going to upload better video quality. So please, Micah.
Thanks, Ulises. And I would like to send to the presenters, the speaker, all of them have shared some excellent presentation. And as a matter of fact, going from the point of view of Dr. Andres Mantilla, today the magazine La República published that by 2030, Colombia's green hydrogen production target could be 1 gigawatts. Estimated by Colombian Geological Service preliminarily revealed that the total projected installed capacity for Colombia with geothermal-based systems would be 1,170 megawatts. Therefore, we invited everyone to the next chapter of our series, How do Petrophysicists Fit into Energy Transition, where we will discuss about geothermal energy as an alternative source of power. Finally, we want to thank for your attention and interest in our webinars. Spwla Colombia Professional Chapter is a voluntary non-profit association that seeks to highlight the value of petrophysics within the hydrocarbon industry, providing a platform that dynamizes ways to transfer knowledge, experiences, and good practices. Invite your colleagues, friends. We want to hear your comments about our activities. Help us to increase the network of interested parties. So let us know your comments by any of our social network or write us to the email spwla.cap.colombia@gmail.com. Please turn on your cameras to leave a photographic record of the activity. On behalf of the Board of Directors of Spwla Colombia, we thank you for your assistance and interest. Thank you very much. We wish you a happy evening and hope to see you all soon in the next opportunity. Good night.
Thank you.
Thanks.
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 Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Ulises, en este caso, por favor, podrías dejar de compartir la pantalla para que aparezcan todas las imágenes.
Seguro.
Okay. 1, 2, and okay, thank you for joining us and support us, and have an excellent week.
Thank you.